Welcome, sports fans. Yes, Bintang's back for Friday News Review number two. What have we got to talk about this week? Well, as you all know, one of my big bugbears is media bias. So, excuse me, I'm going to keep moving my mouse every so often, otherwise, my computer shuts down for reasons unknown. Love technology, it drives me nuts sometimes. Now, I hate media bias. The role of the media in any society, in any country, is to provide you with factual information. Nothing more, nothing less. The idea is that the media presents the facts, information, and you, the reader, watcher, listener, make up your own mind. What, of course, we have happening, particularly in Western media, I can only comment on Western media, but I'm sure it happens in other medias too. So this isn't just targeted at one side of the coin, so to speak. I'm sure the Russians and the North Koreans have their own bias too. Although, having watched RT very carefully for several months, it's far less bias than anything on Western news media. But that's a debate for another day. Let's leave that. But it's increasingly obvious how our views are being controlled and manufactured, manipulated by our media. And that's why it's so hard to have a rational discussion with anyone in this country on subjects of, national world interest, because they're not given factual information and they don't go and look it up. And as we all know, Bintang Bernie's first law, most people are stupid. They believe just what they read. But it's very subtle, the propaganda. It's very difficult to break away from it. So I understand how people are slanted in their opinions because they're having an opinion fed to them rather than being allowed to make one up. Facts. Now, case in point, I just happened to open my phone this morning and there's an article from the ABC, the Australian bullshit company, sadly the ABC, which is something every country should have, a government funded, supposedly independent media source to provide factual information. That's the concept. However, of course, like most things, it's been corrupted. Now the ABC is essentially an information propaganda front for the government and the views that are held to be mainstream at the time. But so this came from the ABC, and it's interesting because, excuse me, mouth's a little dry. It's interesting because this is the headline. Okay, we're talking about media being impartial. It's the headline. Vladimir Putin's crazy ceasefire demands include blueprint for new Russia. How how biased is that? Now, what does that tell you straight away? Okay, so Putin is demanding stuff and he's crazy. What the article is all about is what's come out of the recent talks in Riyadh between the Americans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. And Putin's demands, okay, so we don't hear about Zelensky demanding anything, it's just the Russians are demanding. Well, they're not demanding, it's a negotiation. They're putting forward a negotiation position, a point of view of what they want, okay, for this negotiation to be successful. That's what everyone does at a negotiation. Okay, but by calling it a demand, of course, you make him seem more aggressive. Crazy ceasefire, crazy in inverted commas. Why is it crazy? Well, of course, you have to believe it's crazy because Putin suggested it, and it's crazy because he wants to take all this Ukrainian territory. So let's ignore the bias headline, and a picture of Putin smiling. Now, notice how, I don't know if you can see that, folks, but how they always manage to get, and I'll get you the headline. There's the headline, so you can see I'm not bullshitting. Although Bintang never bullshits. Okay, crazy ceasefire deals. That's a bit blurry there. Sorry, but you get the picture. You can Google it yourself. So let's read on. And it mentions about the summit and how it wasn't an easy dialogue. Okay. Well, of course, it's not an easy dialogue. You're trying to end a major conflict. It's not going to be, you know, these things aren't simple. You're not playing Monopoly here. Okay. Trump said it's a great meeting. Delegations from both countries talked about that. They're trying to discuss a ceasefire. But that's proving elusive. More than 3 years after Russia's full scale invasion of its neighbour, the slaughter continues with gusto. What an interesting statement. Okay. Full scale invasion of its neighbour, the slaughter continues with gusto. So clearly, the impression here is that the Russians are slaughtering Ukrainians. Okay. Now, number one, it's not a full scale invasion. And we know this. That's a lie. Okay. That's a blatant lie there because the White House, the State Department, contacted Zelensky when this conflict first broke out in 2022, and they said, we'll give you a plane to get out of Kiev because we anticipate the whole country will be overrun within 3 weeks. That was what they gave, because that was the assumption based on a full-scale Russian invasion. Anyone with a modicum of intelligence, research Jane's military, army sizes. If the Russians wanted to invade a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this war would have been over. I gave it a month, I think, from memory, 6 weeks. It seems I was wrong. Okay, if you look back at some of my Facebook posts, I said if it was an invasion, it'd be over in a month. The Americans gave 3 weeks, so I was I was slow. I was wrong. I was a month. I was a week out. Russia would have steamrolled Ukraine like that. Okay, so it's not a full-scale invasion. It is exactly what the Russians are saying it is. It is a military operation. They're using a fraction of their military power to do this. Okay, substantial amount. This is a country which has 1.5 million people in its military. Okay, so they can pull a lot more resources in. They haven't started conscription. They did a call up of reservists initially, yes, 300,000, but their economy is still on a non-war footing. There's martial law in Kiev. They're dragging people off the street. That's a full-scale war. Kiev is fighting tooth and nail, everything to hang on. The Russians have just moved in some military units. Okay, and it's interesting to note the 300,000 people that were called up from military reserve are being placed in roles where they're not employed in direct combat units with the actual area of operations. They're in support roles. So that gives you some idea of the amount of stress this is putting on the Russian military. The Russian military, while it's significantly deployed, is not in anything even approaching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Okay, they would have over 1 million people fighting if that's the case, and the war would be over by now. So anyway, let's go on with. So we're just getting, once again, lies, blatant lies that you're being told with no justification or explanation as to how they come to this conclusion. Sorry, thirsty work. I should be drinking beer. I should be drinking Bintang. So, okay, Ukraine's military, meanwhile, claims to have killed more than 900,000 Russian soldiers since February 2022. Okay, all right. Okay, that's what Ukraine's military has claimed. Why don't we have any counter information from the Russian side? Aren't we supposed to provide a bias report here? But we've just got information from the Ukraine's military. Now, the Ukrainian military, we know, has lied repeatedly throughout this conflict. Remember the ghost of Kiev, when they were telling everyone about this great fighter pilot who was shooting down all these Russian planes? Turns out it was a video game. I mean, that's blatant lie, propaganda, not just an error of judgment. Remember the Shark Island, the 2 Ukrainian soldiers? Fuck you, Russian warships. They made stamps and pictures of them and posters you could buy by these 2 brave Ukrainians who refused to give up Shark Island to the evil Russians, who then just blew them up because they're such cunts. Interestingly enough, then both of those guys turned up in a prisoner exchange a couple of months later. So the evil, horrible Russians had actually got off their ships, gone ashore, and taken them prisoner. Doesn't exactly fit with the image of brutal, occupying evil people, does it? But the Yanks wouldn't have done that. That would have just nuked the island. So, the Ukrainian military being quoted as a source is interesting that the ABC would do that when the ABC knows the Ukrainian military is an extremely unreliable source at best. Blatant liars, if you want to be honest, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they're very unreliable. Okay, so I was quoting that, and of course I can tell you that 900,000. You know what the Ukrainian military has done? It's interesting from the start of the campaign. They've quoted their own figures and labelled them as Russian casualties. That's why I don't know if you remember it started. You would have seen it in your Facebook feed. I got it non-stop when this conflict started. Ukraine form or something. It kept coming up about how that the last report I saw, they're up to every day. They showed you how many Russians were being killed. They're up to 40,000 Russians being killed, 3,000 tanks destroyed, all this stuff. Of course, I can't believe people are stupid enough to believe it. I'm no military expert, but it was widely reported that Russia went in with an initial force of 120,000 soldiers. So if the Ukrainians in the first couple of weeks of the war had killed 40,000 soldiers, how could a force of 120,000 lose 40,000 people? Okay, that just logic tells you that then that force would collapse. So I straight away thought, well, the Ukrainians are bullshitting. They can't kill 40,000. Okay, we now know in retrospect that it was 40,000 Ukrainians that had been killed up to that time. Ukrainian casualties are reliably predicted to be over 1 million men. Okay, that's what your hero Zelensky's done for you, Ukraine. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, US and Russia say ceasefire negotiations now focused on territory. Okay, they're not now focused on territory. This whole thing has been about territory from the beginning. Okay, the Donbass region has been under attack. Oh God, I've done it again. I fucking hate this because I forgot to move my mouse around, and now my computer has shut down its screen. It's still recording, but I can't see what I'm recording, and it's rather disconcerting for me. So I'll just open it up again. Remember moving that mouse. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. So, where were we? Yeah, so it's always been about territory. The people in the Donbass region were being killed, being attacked in a civil war by their own government. They're technically Ukrainian citizens who were being killed by the Ukrainian military. That's what this is all about, because they're ethnic Russians. And Ukraine is full of right-wing, neo-Nazi extremists who are intent on destroying the ethnic Russians. There's a huge Russian element in Ukraine because traditionally a lot of the area has always been part of the Russian Empire. Okay, so territory has always been an issue. So it's not, they're making out that suddenly it's a land grab by the Russians. No, it's always been about territory and ensuring the security of the ethnic Russians in that area, which, by the way, any country would do. If we had ethnic Australians being butchered in Papua New Guinea, we would be going into Papua New Guinea to protect them, and there would be conflict there. We'd put troops in. That's what every country does. But when Russia does it, you're told it's evil, it's wrong, and it's a disaster, and you have to protest it, because you've got to hate the Russians. That's what you're told. Sorry. So anyway, we'll go on. Okay. Ukrainian President Zelensky, because we keep quoting Zelensky, the wannabe rock star who's promoted throughout the world, his fanboy, and everything that comes out of his mouth becomes, fact. Like, what happened to the 10,000 North Korean soldiers, that were in this conflict? Vlad, that came from, I call him Vladimir, because Vladimir and Volodymyr, it's the same name, just different pronunciations. But we don't want him to have the same name as Putin. So it's very, media contrived to make sure there's a differentiation between good and evil. Remember that 10,000 North Korean soldiers? That came out of a quote from Zelensky. There has never been any evidence of it. And from day one, I laughed at it. People are once again so stupid. What's Bintang's first law? Sorry, there we are. I'd never make a good weather chick, would I? I couldn't do that blue screen thing. But, Bintang's first law, most people are stupid. Everyone believed it about these North Korean soldiers. People were telling me, there's North Koreans. Show me some evidence. They showed me a picture of some Russians and North Koreans together. I said, you do understand Russia and North Korea share a border. They do have military operation and cooperation together. It's not hard to find pictures of them together. And then I got, but see some of the Russian soldiers, they've got eyes like this. You do understand Russia occupies Europe and Asia. It's the largest landmass country in the world, and a large portion of its population who are Russian citizens are ethnically Asians. So they do look like that, Anyway, we'll talk about that another day. So let's go on. So basically what I'm saying is Zelensky's a liar and he's full of bullshit. And that's been proven the case time and time again. Okay, all right, so they go on, and so Russian newspaper, which they met, Kommersant, last week, reported that it claimed that Putin had stated that he would demand 6 Ukrainian regions, Crimea, Sevastopol, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, as part of the talks. The interesting thing is, okay, and then it says, sorry, I'll go on, Russia's military currently occupies most, but not all of these areas. In September 2022, Mr. Putin announced to Russia's parliament the territories had been officially annexed, something not recognized by the international community. Now, that's what you get from the ABC. Why doesn't it mention that in September 22, it's correct, in September 22, Mr. Putin did announce to Russia's parliament that those territories had been officially annexed as the result of a democratic election. Why doesn't it mention that? You see, because that would then add some doubt into the thought processes. It's much better to say Putin announced it's been annexed. That sounds like a dictator, doesn't that? Something that Hitler would say. See how they manipulate your thought processes. They leave out the important part that Putin only announced that after they'd held democratic elections. Now, people straight away, I love the way when democracy provides a result we don't like, we talk about how it's corrupted and manipulated. Doesn't sound like such a great system if it's so easy to corrupt and manipulate, does it? Sorry, I slurped a bit there. I hate slurping. The election that was held in those regions, okay, which is full of predominantly Russian, ethnic Russians, which is why the Ukrainians were trying to kill them all. Those elections, the Russians invited 1,000 people from different countries all around the world as independent observers. Now, ask me any time when you've heard of countries doing that, when they actually invite independent observers to come in and look and see how our electoral process is run. That straight off the bat tells me, well, that's interesting. That doesn't sound like a cover-up, a staged election. And interestingly enough, one of the people, I saw an interview with a lady from Indonesia who was from every country. The Indonesian lady spoke very highly of the electoral process. Now you might say, oh, well, Indonesia's elections are dodgy anyway. What would she know? The guy who went there from Australia, he was from a council in West Australia, and he, it was an open invitation. You apply and go over there. He came back and he said the elections were very fair, extremely fair, transparent, and open. He actually said they're more transparent than in his own country here in Australia. What was the response? The council moved a motion to kick him off the council. How's that? Now, we talk about democracy and transparency. If somebody comes back and says something we don't like, and the council that he's a part of, the Democratic Council, moves to have him kicked off. Now, the people in that region elected him to that council. That's how democracy works. Doesn't mean you can't stop him from saying what he thinks. But of course, our version of democracy is all about you're free to think and do whatever you want as long as it's the way we tell you. So when I talk about territory, I'm talking about the Donbass area. The elections were held there. The people overwhelmingly voted to reunify with Russia because traditionally those areas were all part of the Russian Empire for centuries. That's why there's so many Russians living there. That's why Ukraine had two official languages, Ukrainian and Russian, which of course the government then banned Russian. Imagine having your own language banned in your own country. So of course these people almost unanimously wanted to go back to Russia because that's where they feel a bond. And for the last 8 years, the Ukrainians, the country they're in, has been trying to kill them. So it's no surprise that that would happen and that election would be that way. So technically, if you look at this, not even technically, just under international law, those regions have now voted to become part of Russia. Okay? Now remember, okay, self-determination is one of the founding principles. The right of self-determination is a founding principle of the UN Charter. It's also one of the key tenets of democracy. So we have to abide by their views because, put it in another perspective, when Taiwan wants independence from China, why do we support them so fervently and say they've got a right to determine their future? We don't allow the same process to be held in the region of the Donbass. Interesting comparison, isn't it? Juxtapose those two. So technically, I keep using the word technically and then correcting myself. Sorry, no, under international law, those areas are now part of Russia. They're not occupied by Russian troops, which it says Russia's military currently occupies most, but not all of those areas. Well, they're now Russian areas, so the Russian military isn't occupying them. The Ukrainian military is actually now in Russian territory because the Donbass is now no longer part of Ukraine. And bing, bing, wake up call, people. It never will be, okay? The Ukrainians are losing this war. That idiot Zelensky, rather than negotiating a deal in 2023, the one that Boris Johnson undermined, okay, by telling them to keep fighting, where he would have kept all of that territory, where Putin agreed that Ukraine should maintain its territorial integrity. Now Zelensky's lost all that because he's a fucking idiot, all right? And he's slaughtering his own people for his own personal gain. That man is a dog and he will go down in history as an absolute betrayer of his own people. He's an absolute dog. He's a pig. Okay, sorry, getting carried away. So we go on. Okay, next paragraph. Vlad, and excuse me, hate to sound racist, but these Eastern European names are a fucking nightmare to pronounce. Okay, can I buy a vowel? Vlad Minyenko, I'd say, professor of geography and political economy at Oxford University, said the idea of Ukrainian troops withdrawing from Russian areas was fanciful. The Russian side is putting up crazy claims and then probably, okay, that's insightful, probably trying to walk back from them. But it looks like the American administration is not pushing back at all. Okay, and he says, I'm not sure that Ukrainians are going to agree to these crazy demands. Okay, so All right. So he's used the word crazy twice in these claims. Okay, which, if I just showed you, are not only quite rational claims. They've been the Russian standpoint from the start of the military operation. That's why they went in there, to protect the people in the Donbass, which they saw as their Russian brethren. So this guy, anyway, is quoted. He's a professor of geography. Now, who is Vladimirenko? Doesn't say, does it? Doesn't mention. So the average person just takes this once again as fact verbatim. So I looked up Vladimirenko. He's from the University of Kiev. So clearly, he's a Ukrainian with a very, let's say, specific viewpoint on how all this goes. He also brings in millions, at the last count, $15.6 million, pounds, sorry, into Oxford University with his publications and other work he's done. So he's, let's just say, he's not the most unbiased person. But why doesn't it tell you who Vladimirenko is? Now, I'm not saying promote him up there as Captain Kiev. Oh, he's going to give you one point of view. But just say Vladimirenko from the University of Ukraine, from the University of Kiev. It's not Kiev, no, it's Kiev. I'm trying to order chicken Kiev in a restaurant now. I think you've got purettes. Have a chicken Kiev for dinner. I don't know why that's changed, but so be it. But why not say he's from Kiev? Why not mention that? Okay, it just mentions him being from University of Oxford. So straight away he's taken some verbatim source when actually he's giving a quite slanted view of these proposals. And once again, using the word crazy as a pejorative to basically say how ridiculous the Russian point is. Russia prepared to play a long game. His report, which attributes the leak information, the Russians will go on and start. Kremlin defines Odessa as well as part of Ukraine, as part of new Russia. Okay, all right. Mr. Putin used the term new Russia, and it's got a map down. If you can see it, showing you the areas. You probably can't. Oh, that's pretty good. Okay, so you see the dark red where the Russians currently are, and the light red as the areas that the Kremlin defines as new Russia. Not interestingly enough, the areas they're saying they'll take in the negotiations. So once again, see how the map's biased? It's showing a much larger part of the area. And I don't know if I can get this so you can see it, but this section down here, oh look, I'm doing the weather girl thing. That is not part of the negotiations, okay? That's defined as New Russia, but the Russians aren't claiming it as part of the negotiations. They're just claiming the rest of the territory where the troops already are, the 4 oblasts in the Donbass. Okay, so the map once again is not being factual. It's not being open. And then it says, I love the way they unthinkingly, it's not dumb now, that they undermine their own statements. The word Novorossiya, which means New Russia, first appeared in 1764. So back in 1764, this area was part of Russia. Okay, so they're undermining the fact that somehow this is a new thing. This area has traditionally been Russian territory. It's part of the Russian Empire, going back hundreds of years. Okay, Ukraine basically officially appeared in 1991. Okay, but there is some justification to there being a Ukraine. I'm not saying it shouldn't exist, but let's keep things in perspective. Okay, all right. Then this idiot goes on. Just imagine if in some parallel universe Britain attacked Australia tomorrow and said, "Well, New South Wales is Wales. They speak English, so we're going to reoccupy." See how they make light. They make it seem so fanciful. How ridiculous the Russian point of view is by giving you a totally unrelated scenario. Okay. Firstly, if Britain attacked Australia tomorrow because New South Wales and we speak English. Firstly, it's not like Queensland has been killing us and banning us from speaking English and slaughtering us and dropping bombs on us. It is also not like New South Wales butts up against the coast of England. Okay, so it's the parallel to say, imagine if Britain attacked Australia to defend New South Wales is totally ridiculous. It bears no similarity to the current conflict in Ukraine at all. Okay, so it's just classical. Okay, so it goes on. A report in the Moscow Times. Now this is a good one. I'll have a sip for this one. A report in the Moscow Times, an anti-Kremlin newspaper based in Amsterdam. Well, fuck, there's a great source of information for it. There's a wonderfully, factual, unbiased source. The Moscow Times, which is based in Amsterdam, okay, which is in Holland, okay, who are currently the leaders of NATO, by the way. Old dog Rutte is the new president of the European Union. Um, and it says openly, it's an anti-Kremlin newspaper. So why are we quoting this as a source of information? This is my point. Why would you quote sources for factual information, which you're also saying are clearly completely biased? You would discount that. A journalist should discount that and go, well, anything published in the Moscow Times is obviously going to be propaganda because they're an anti-Kremlin newspaper. They're not going to give me reliable information. So why would I even look at it? But they quote it. Okay. Either Trump influences Ukraine to leave, we're told, or they enter into long negotiations and simply use military force to establish control. Okay, the official said Mr. Putin would not back down in controlling all the Ukrainian regions he'd announced he'd annexed in 2022. Well, as we said, of course he won't, because he announced they were annexed after those regions had voted to become part of Russia. So they're part of Russia. He's not going to give them away. Okay, you know, blah, blah, blah. It goes on. Mr. Putin signed, this is a good one. Mr. Putin signed an order last week requiring people in occupied Ukraine to regulate their legal status by taking out Russian citizenship by September 10. If they don't, they'll be classified as foreigners and subject to residency and work restrictions, just like they are in every other fucking country in the whole world. Okay, so the lies here. Mr. Putin signed an order requiring people in occupied Ukraine. There is no occupied Ukraine. Those territories, as I've said repeatedly, are now part of Russia. Okay, so he's talking about what happens in Russia, not in Ukraine. But see how you lied to? Okay, occupied Ukraine. There is no such thing. All right, what there is occupied Russia. Ukrainian troops are now occupying Russia, as I explained before. They have to regulate their status by taking out Russian citizenship. Well, that's what happens in any country. It happens here in Australia. You have to have your status. You're either an Australian citizen or you'll be classified as a foreigner and subjected to residency and work restrictions. Verbatim, what I'm reading off here. I wish you could see this more clearly. Okay, it's really okay. That paragraph there. All right. So if they don't, they'll be classified as foreigners and subjected to residency and work restrictions, as happens in every other fucking country in the world. Okay, if you're not a citizen, you're a non-citizen, and you're subject to restrictions and residency and work. Happens here, happens everywhere. Okay, now it's happening in Russian territory. But see, they're lying to you, telling you it's occupied Ukraine. Legally, it is no longer occupied Ukraine. Legally, it is Russia. So he has every right to regulate the status of citizens in his own country. He's their president, whether you like him or not. And remember, this is not about whether you like Putin or love Zelensky. This is about looking at factual information and how it is misrepresented to make you think a certain way. Next section of the story. There is no other way to stop this war, in bold. No other way to stop this war. Funny. I couldn't think of quite a few ways to stop a war myself. But anyway, Roman Kovalenko, 38, and his twin brother Dmitry have been fighting for Ukraine. Okay, so once again, all we're getting through this is Ukrainian people telling you their side of the story. Now, I'm fine with that. Don't get me wrong. But journalism is about unbiased reporting. So every time you quote a Ukrainian source, you should quote a Russian source. You should provide both sides of the argument. It's not rocket science, and then let people decide. Okay? But all we've got so far is Ukrainian professors, anti-Moscow, anti-Kremlin newspapers, and now we've got Ukrainian soldiers from the front line. Okay? Now these guys are saying it's very difficult because the Russians are storming us every day. Okay? It must be horrible. Don't get me wrong. I've sympathy for these poor fucks being forced to fight for this prick Zelensky in a war they never, ever, ever were going to win. Okay? You're taking on a nuclear superpower on your doorstep. Right idea. Our job is constantly think of new maneuvers and strategies. Okay, it's really difficult. I've done it again. I'm going to fucking smash this computer one day, and I'll have to buy a new one. Pardon me while I open it up again. As I said, it doesn't make any difference to the video. You still see a change, but I get a blank screen, and it's rather disconcerting. I like to look at myself. So poor Roman and Dmitry are fighting their guts out on the line. Okay. And, it's Roman worked for the tax office before. I wouldn't advise that, mate. Your own people are likely to shoot you. He says he don't think there'll be a ceasefire any time soon. His quote, okay, what we need to put an end to this is 3 to 4 times more weapons to strengthen our army, he said. All right. So you've already got, what's the current count? About 180, $200 billion. Okay, $200 billion. I'll say that again. 200 billion. I'll keep saying that. You've got all this weaponry. You've got, ATACMS, Abrams tanks, F-16s, the latest stuff we can throw at you. And what's it gotten you? Defeat. You've been losing ground non-stop. You've been getting beaten, you're getting smashed. Your casualties are horrific. So clearly, the fancy weapons that were, touted as a be-all and end-all, the wonder weapons, it's like Hitler, isn't it? The wonder weapons. They haven't done anything, okay? Armies need to take ground. And to take ground and hold it, you need one thing: troops, soldiers. Okay, you can have all the fancy weaponry you like, but if you don't have enough soldiers, you can't conquer and maintain your ground. You lose ground. Okay, and we now know, anyone who's done, and once again, the slightest bit of research on this can tell you that the Ukrainians have a massive manpower problem. They basically killed all the young men. They're dragging people off the street. There are videos aplenty of them shanghaiing people and throwing them into cars, forcing them to go and fight because they're now under martial law. And you can give them as many weapons as you want. Who's going to fire them? Who's going to use them? But this guy says we'll give more weapons. So we're giving all these weapons, and he says the only way to stop it is to give us even more weapons. I reckon the better way to stop it, old Dmitry, or no, this is Roman, his brother. Roman, I reckon the better way to stop it would be to sit down with the Russians and have a bit of a chat and work something out, because I don't think, if we give you more weapons, it's going to make a fuck all the difference. And of course, our stupid government's just given you, or just pledged to give you all our Abrams tanks, okay? Of course, my tax dollars going to fight a war on the other side of the world. Yeah, that's what I pay tax for, you fucking dogs. Anyway, don't get started. Rather easy to do. So he's skeptical about a temporary truce, warning it could backfire on Ukraine and its allies. Even if there is a 30-day ceasefire, the enemy is going to restore its capacity and fill up its reserves with weapons, equipment, and continue to fight this war, he said. Well, of course they are. And in fact, that's why the Russians are never going to agree to a 30-day ceasefire, because they know that that's what you're going to do, Roman. That's their big issue, is if we have a ceasefire, all you're going to do is allow the Ukrainians to have a pause and rebuild. Meanwhile, every day the Russians are taking territory. The last information coming out is that they now have 150,000 soldiers in reserve waiting for a major offensive push. So the Russians are in no need of a 30-day ceasefire. So you've got to understand, when you're talking about issues like this, what do people need? What are they going to accept? What do they want? The Russians don't want a ceasefire. They're winning. They've got heaps of reserves. They're not grabbing people off the streets. They haven't introduced compulsory conscription, and they're not even on a wartime economy. People are going to jobs and working in Russia. Now, they're doing quite well. It's the Ukrainians who are up against it. And that's why the Russians don't want a 30-day ceasefire, and there's never going to be one, because they know all it would do is benefit Ukraine. Russia doesn't need a 30-day ceasefire. Russia doesn't want a 30-day ceasefire. Okay, before Roman, he's just a grunt on the front line. He doesn't fucking know what's going on. Poor fucker. Okay, they're talking about ceasefires and blah, blah, blah. Russian, this is an interesting one. They're talking about if there was an informal truce and what the Russians would accept. Russia's foreign ministry also said that it wouldn't sign up to the agreement until sanctions were lifted on the country's financial institutions involved in international food and fertilizer trade. Isn't that interesting? There's an admission that we, the wonderful, glorious, peace-loving West, have put sanctions on financial institutions involved with international food and fertilizer trade. Aren't we supposed to be helping poor countries? Isn't it the evil Russians that were stopping all the food? That's what we're told before. The Russians aren't supplying grain and stuff. The Russians have actually been supplying grain for free to a whole lot of countries. I could list them off. That, once again, that's another Friday news review. But it highlights this. I mean, people are stupid. They just read through that. I stop and I read that and think, well, why are we sanctioning international food trade anyway? I mean, well, shouldn't we be sanctioning weapons and stuff? If we're going to sanction the bad stuff. Why would you sanction international food when half the world is fucking starving? But we're sanctioning it. We're stopping the Russian international food trade. Okay, that doesn't help Russia. Okay, it bring in a minuscule amount of money to their economy. Okay, but it keeps people starving to death alive, and we are stopping it. Okay, and an admission there, right there in black and white for you. But of course, just overlooked because you've been programmed all through evil Russia, evil Russia, evil Russia. Okay. Okay. It talks about the US and Russia implementing measures to stop the energy infrastructure attacks. That was part of. That was the tidbit that Putin gave to Trump to make him feel he'd achieved something. We won't attack your infrastructure. What, of course, happened immediately? The Ukrainians attacked a major oil and gas pumping station which supplies gas to Europe. That's why it came out in the news. The Europeans were angry about it because it was fucking with them. So the Russians held to their part of the deal. The Ukrainians immediately broke the deal. Tells you a lot about the perspective sides, or respective sides. Sorry. Okay. Amid and this is good. Amid the talks, fighting continues to rage with massive casualties on front lines that have been largely frozen for months. Total lies. The front lines haven't been frozen for months. They've been moving, and they've been moving to the west. Every day, Russia is taking more territory. Every day, the front lines are moving. So that's a blatant lie. Largely frozen for months. Any simple research, you'll find that out. Every day, the Russians are taking ground. Okay, all right. So I mean, that's ridiculous. Fighting continues to rage with massive casualties. Okay, there have been. It doesn't mention that the majority of the casualties are on the Ukrainian side, interestingly enough. But okay, let's go with that. Okay, Professor Yaroslav Hrstak, I think I got that right, a historian from Kiev's Ukrainian Catholic University. Once again, another Ukrainian point of view. Where is the counterweight? Where is the counterbalance to allow you to make up your mind? Why aren't we asking some of the Russian professors and Russian academics what they think of this? We're only asking Ukrainians time and time again. You're getting one side, one point of view. That's bias. That's not news. That's not information. That is bias. Now, this guy says, the Russian forces have made ground in some areas. The progress is much slower than it used to be. Well, hang on. The Russian forces have made ground in some areas. You've just told me the paragraph before that the front lines that have been largely frozen for months. So there straight away is a contradiction. I just read that and go, you're telling me the front line's frozen. Then in the next paragraph, you're saying progress is much slower than it used to be. So it slowed down. It was faster before, and now it's slowing down. So clearly it's fluid. It's not frozen. See? Lies. Basically lies. Okay, for 3 years I've been a prey to the collapse of the front line, but it's never happened. This is this Ukrainian guy, blah, blah. He said, well, Ukraine had a manpower problem. Hang on. Now we're admitting it. There is a manpower problem. Okay, let's send them some more weapons for the people they don't have to use, Old Roman and his friends. Way to go. They're making up for it, though, and for the manpower problems in other areas with drone technology. So are the Russians. If you see any footage from the front line, forget these idiots like, Peter Dumpton, who's an absolute fucking belongs in the last century, buying tanks and stuff like that. Drones are the way to go. Warfare has changed, believe me. This is exactly what makes Ukraine an asset. You don't have any other army in Europe which has this kind of experience. So this guy's kind of sprue. You should support Ukraine. It's fair enough. He's Ukrainian. Okay, I'm not against that. I'm just saying you need to be aware that every single person, every outlet they have quoted in this article is from the Ukrainian side. There's no counterbalance from the Russian side to give you a, independent, balanced viewpoint. And don't get me wrong, the Russian side will give you a Russian viewpoint biased from their point of view, but at least it allows you to look at the both and make up a midpoint, make up your mind. But you're only getting one side of the story. That's my point. And then this is one thing I find funny too. Now remember, I'll just go back, and read that to you again. I hate to repeat myself, but amid the talks, fighting continues to rage with massive casualties on front lines that have been largely frozen for months. That's the ABC's paragraph. Exactly 4 or 5 paragraphs later, exactly 4 or 5, you idiots, Stu. Okay, now we talk. One area where Ukraine has lost almost all ground. Well, hang on. If the front lines are largely frozen, how could you be losing all ground? One area where Ukraine has lost almost all ground is in Russia's Kursk region. After a surprise attack last year, Kiev's forces at one point occupied hundreds of square kilometers of territory. Okay. However, as this week, they'd largely been pushed back to the border, and Professor Hrstak described this operation as a failure. So the front lines are largely frozen, but the Russian advance is slowing down, and the hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of territory that the Kiev forces took have now been pushed back out by the Russians. All this happening in a war where the front lines are largely frozen. Yeah? Is it just me? Okay. Kursk had been seen as a potential bargaining trip in exchange for land that Russia currently occupies. Well, once again, the Russians don't occupy it. It's now technically their land. Okay. Analysts argue that fighting Moscow's invasion will become more difficult. Well, you can go on and on about that. So you can see, look, what that's all about, long and short of it, is you can see how, once again, you're not being presented with a balanced factual report. You're being given one side of the story with no counterbalance to allow you to decide. You might read the counterbalance and go, the Russians are speaking shit. I'll believe what the Ukrainians are saying. That's fine. But you should be given the option to do that, not just told what the Ukrainian professors think, what the anti-Kremlin newspaper is telling you, and what the soldiers on the front line who are in the Ukrainian army are telling you. You should have some information from the other side. In any conflict, in any situation, you want to see both sides of the view, but you don't, because you're lied to. And that is why it's so difficult to talk about the whole Ukrainian issue, because people keep talking about Russia's unprovoked aggression. We've been provoking Russia since basically the end of the Cold War, but steadily since 2007 and 2008. We've got Bill Burns' telegram in 2008 talking about how the Russians were concerned about American meddling in Ukraine. So it shows you the Americans were back there in 2008, doesn't it? Okay. And where Bill Burns said quite clearly in his 2008 telegram, Ukraine is a red line that the Russians are not prepared to cross. They don't want to cross, but it's a red line for them. They'll cross it if they have to. So back in 2008, the Russians were saying, stay out of Ukraine. We don't want to have issues there, but if you push it, it's going to cross a red line. So their viewpoint has been consistent for, 17 odd years. And so now we're told this is unprovoked aggression. We've been poking the Russians with our actions in supporting the neo-Nazis, overthrowing the Ukrainian elected government in 2014, and allowing them to try and slaughter ethnic Russians ever since. The actual question is not that the wars have been unprovoked. The actual question is, why did it take Russia so long to militarily intervene to save their people? And if you've seen any of the discussions coming out from the Ukrainian people, one of the things that the Donbass residents are saying is, why did it take Russia so long to come and save us? So, people are being, once again, lied to and made to feel a certain way, to think a certain way, and not presented with any facts. Anyway, that's what we do here at the Winston Smith Project. We present you with facts. We look at what Big Brother is saying, and we cut through the truth, because we are looking around us and we're seeing the lies before the little bits of paper slip down into the furnace to be burned and reimagined. Anyway, I'd like to wish you all a happy day, and thanks for tuning in to Friday News Review with your host, Bintang.